Hi everyone, and welcome to the supplemental lecture. After we went through the process of identifying research questions and hypotheses, which was really helpful for me to get a sense of where you guys all were in understanding research questions and the development of hypotheses, I wanted to put together a little bit of a supplemental lecture on research questions and hypotheses. So I posted the lecture that I recently created for the 510 class. And so this is an expansion on that to think a little bit about the different kinds of research questions and how to set up hypotheses based on those research questions and think about what the variables are and what those questions are saying and then how to phrase the hypotheses. So this is something, just as an aside, that I'll be covering in much more detail in 850 moving forward the next time that I teach this sequence. So this was really helpful. I know a lot of you felt like you were stumbling, but it was really helpful for me in thinking about how to redesign this class, particularly for 850 for next semester. So thanks again for being the guinea pigs for this one. So this is straight from the 510 lecture, but some research question criteria. Obviously, it should be a question. The question should imply the possibility of actually empirically testing that question and coming up with an answer. Really key things are being specific about your variables and giving your reader a sense of the operationalization of those variables. I know many of you are covering operationalization of variables in 831. So hopefully this makes some sense to you in thinking about what I mean by operationalization. And then for research questions more generally, you'll always think about what kinds of evidence you'll need to answer your question and if that evidence is feasible to obtain. And you always want to make sure that you can turn your question into a hypothesis. That will help you determine if your question is an appropriate and well-worded question. This question should always suggest a relationship to be examined, so between an independent and a dependent variable or multiple kinds of variables. And your variables should be clear. Independent, dependent, control, whatever should be clear from the question. Your reader should be able to look at that question and identify immediately what your independent and dependent variables are, as well as other control, moderator, mediator variables. And so we'll do a quick overview one more time for those of you who maybe are still struggling to think through the independent versus dependent variable and the ways in which other variables may play a role in some of these associations that we're thinking through. So independent variable is in experimental research, I think independent variable is fairly easy to know what that is. It's the factor that we manipulate. So often it's intervention condition or components of an intervention. So a control condition versus an education condition or different kinds of education conditions. And so I think that's often an easier one for folks to figure out. In non-experimental research, though, the variables that we examine as predictors of other variables are what we refer to as independent variables. So this is gender when we're comparing groups on gender and looking at gender differences. It's maybe individual characteristics like self-esteem if we're thinking that self-esteem influences some other variable or predicts an outcome on some other variable. Dependent variables, sort of inherent in the name of dependent variables, are outcome variables that we think depend on independent variables. So you can always try and remember it by looking at what the actual word is. And so knowing what we know about dependent variables, some variables can never be dependent variables, such as biological sex or race. We're never going to say that self-esteem predicts whether or not somebody was born male or female, or self-esteem predicts whether somebody is white or black or Asian. So there are certain things that can and can't be dependent variables. And so when we're talking about so many of the statistical analyses that we're talking about, we're often interested in the nature of that dependent variable to determine what kind of tests that we can do, what kinds of relationships we can talk about. So your IV and your DV are incredibly important in thinking through research questions. Many of you wanted to think about questions that were about mediation or moderation. We can think about some of those things based on some of the analyses that we're going to do. And so for those of you who are maybe questioning whether or not you want to go that route at this point, we might come back to that after we've covered some of the statistical tests that may help you determine if you actually are going to be able to look at those associations using the skills that we learned in this class. So, and I think mediator versus moderator is one of the most difficult things for people to learn. I think I literally remember the moment in my life when this light bulb went off for me and when I was able to understand the difference between a mediator and a moderator variable. So mediating variables are variables that we think may mediate an association between an independent and dependent variable. So for example, we know from the literature that there is an association between gender and drug use. So men are often more likely to use drugs more frequently, and so there is sort of basic relationship in the form of a group difference between men and women on substance use. And so we want to find out why that association exists, find out the mechanism of that association. And one of the things that we know is that men tend to be higher on average in sensation seeking, and that sensation seeking is then associated with drug use. And so in this particular situation, we would call sensation seeking a mediating variable in here, or say that sensation seeking mediates the relationship between gender and drug use. Moderating variables, on the other hand, are variables that we think may influence or change an association between an independent and a dependent variable. So, for example, we also, from some of the literature, know that depression can influence drug use. So the frequency of drug use, the likelihood of drug use, however we want to define that outcome. But we may find in some research that this relationship may be different for men and women. So maybe for women, this association is stronger because women are using drugs more to cope with negative affect, whereas men may be using drugs for different kinds of reasons, or vice versa. Men may be using drugs more often to cope with depression or negative affect, whereas women may be using for other kinds of reasons. And so if we think that this basic association between depression and drug use would be different for men and women, we would say that gender would moderate the association between depression and drug use. So a moderating variable is a variable that would change an association between an independent and a dependent variable. And a mediating variable is one that would explain in some ways an association between an independent and dependent variable. So we often talk about mediating variables as a mechanism of some association. And then we also talk about control variables, so variables that we may want to control for when we look at other kinds of associations and remove the influence of them so that we have a more pure look at some other association. And extraneous and confounding variables can be similar to this. We may control for them, we may not control for them, we may only see them afterwards, but these are variables that we often do want to try and get rid of their influence in some way to be able to better understand the associations that we're actually interested in. So coming back to research questions, we'll talk about quantitative research questions for this class, obviously. So some of the questions that we ask are descriptive questions. So what are the sexual health practices of low-income adolescents in Philadelphia? And we want to operationalize both of these things. So many things in this question. So sexual health practices, are we referring to testing? Are we referring to condom use, birth control, communication strategies? What kind of things are we talking about, or what specific things are we talking about when we're talking about sexual health practices? What do we count as low income? What do we count as adolescents? So we're often wanting to operationalize a bit more than we may in our first pass at an initial research question. Another kind of research question is one in which we're comparing groups. So some examples of this are, how do the sexual health practices of low-income adolescent girls compare to the sexual health practices of low-income adolescent boys? So again, we would operationalize some of these things, but this is a basic comparison. And if we're looking at this and we're thinking about the variables that are involved in here, I can look at this question and know that sexual health practices is the outcome variable that we're looking at. And so sexual health practices of these folks, so we have low-income adolescent girls and low-income adolescent boys as our two groups. And so the difference between those two groups is gender here, or biological sex, depending on how we're defining that. And so I would know that my independent variable is sex, and there are two levels of it, girls and boys. and then sexual health practices is my dependent variable. Another example would be, how do the sexual health practices of adolescents receiving treatment as usual compare to the sexual health practices of adolescents receiving some amazing evidence-based intervention that you've developed? And so again, whether or not people get that intervention is your independent variable. So the treatment condition, basically, and that has two levels, or it can have more than two levels. So maybe people who get this intervention, people who get treatment as usual, and people who get nothing. People who are on a wait list control, for example, or people who aren't engaged in care. So we can have two levels to this. We may have more levels to this. In this particular question, we have two levels to this variable. And a third type of question that we often ask is, how do specific variables or constructs relate to one another? How are they associated? And this, the comparison of groups is a subset of that in some ways. But for this particular type of question, we're looking at basic types of associations. So to what extent does socioeconomic status relate to adolescent sexual health practices? And so again, we could look at socioeconomic status in a variety of ways here. Perhaps we're looking at maternal education. That's often a marker of socioeconomic status. Perhaps we're looking at just income level. Perhaps we're looking at a variable that combines a whole bunch of different markers of socioeconomic status. And then again, trying to define what sexual health practices would be in a more operationalized way. Another example would be, how does socioeconomic status relate to adolescent sexual health practices once we control for the effects of educational attainment? So maybe we're looking at the role of income on adolescent sexual health practices, but a big part of income may actually be educational attainment. And so educational attainment might be actually what's influencing sexual health practices. So we want to remove the effect of educational attainment if we actually want to see an association between income, for example, and sexual health practices. Another type of question that we could ask would be, how does mother's education level influence timing of sexual initiation? And I'll come back to this one and talk about operationalizing this a little bit more, but we could talk about the number of years of mother's education. We could talk about different levels, so those who have a college education versus those who don't. We could just do straight number of years as a continuous variable. And then when we're talking about timing of sexual initiation, our dependent variable here, our outcome variable, what we think is influenced by another variable, then we could talk about defining that in a variety of different ways. So any kind of sex that they're having, are we talking only about vaginal or anal sex, only vaginal sex? How would we define that? So with each of these, again, it's always important to think about what our independent variables are and what our dependent variables are. In this case, we have a control variable here as well that we can identify based just on looking at this question. So I'm going to take the comparison research questions and the association research questions and break those out a little bit and talk about what the null and research hypotheses would look like for these different kinds of questions. So for comparison research questions, let's take this one. How do the sexual risk behaviors, this is a more operationalized version of one of the questions that I posed in the last slide. How do the sexual risk behaviors, defined as condomless anal or vaginal sex, of adolescents receiving treatment as usual compare to the sexual risk behaviors of adolescents receiving my amazing evidence-based intervention? So again, in this situation, we're looking at sexual risk behavior, specifically the number of condomless vaginal or anal sex acts, as our outcome or dependent variable. And then our independent variable is the treatment condition. So are they receiving treatment as usual, or some intervention that we've developed and are looking to test? And again, we're comparing these two groups, these two levels of our independent variable on their outcome that we're interested in, on the number of sexual risk behaviors. Our null hypothesis, and we could state both the null and the alternative hypotheses in a variety of different ways. I think it's often useful to try and think of them as linguistically similar as possible, to try and make sure that you're posing the same kinds of hypotheses. So a null hypothesis would be that adolescents receiving my intervention will not report significantly different numbers of sexual risk acts, defined as condomless vaginal or anal sex acts, than adolescents receiving treatment as usual. So comparing the two levels of our independent variable, there's not going to be any difference on our dependent variable. A directional research hypothesis for this question might be that adolescents receiving my intervention will report significantly fewer sexual risk acts than adolescents receiving treatment as usual. So again, talking about the level of outcome variable that somebody will have based on their level of the independent variable, their group of the independent variable. And then if we wanted to look at a non-directional research hypothesis, we could simply say that adolescents receiving my intervention will report significantly different numbers of sexual risk acts when compared to adolescents receiving treatment as usual. So we don't know maybe which is going to be lower or higher than the other, but we think that they're going to be different. Another kind of comparison research question that we could look at would be, how do the levels of contraceptive self-efficacy differ between those with a religious affiliation compared to those without a religious affiliation? So again, we look here, levels of contraceptive self-efficacy is our dependent variable, and our independent variable is religious affiliation, with and without are the levels or the groups of our independent variable. Our null hypothesis here would be that adolescents with and without a religious affiliation will not differ in their levels of contraceptive self-efficacy. A directional hypothesis would be that adolescents with a religious affiliation will score significantly lower on contraceptive self-efficacy. And I say lower conceptually because we know that on this scale it's flipped around. So people who score higher are actually sort of less confident in their abilities and their contraceptive abilities when compared to those without a religious affiliation. And then a non-directional hypothesis would be that adolescents with and without a religious affiliation will significantly differ in their levels of contraceptive self-efficacy. So we can see here for the null and the non-directional hypothesis that these are phrased very similarly. So adolescents with and without a religious affiliation, this is our independent variable, the two groups that we have, will not differ and will significantly differ in their levels of contraceptive self-efficacy. So for the non-directional hypotheses, we can phrase those in pretty much identical ways, with the exception of saying that there will not be a difference in the two groups versus there will be a difference in the two groups. And then when we look at the association research questions, we could say, come back to this question of how does mother's education level influence timing of sexual initiation? Defined as the age of first vaginal or anal sexual intercourse, and we could define that obviously however we wanted to. So again, mother's education level is the independent variable, and in this situation we'll think about it as a continuous variable, so the number of years of schooling that a mother has. And timing of sexual initiation, this is age of first vaginal or anal sex. So these are two continuous variables that we're looking at here. And so our null hypothesis would be that mother's education level will not be significantly associated with, or will not be a significant predictor of, we could say it that way as well, age of first sexual intercourse. Directional hypothesis would be that mother's education level will be positively associated with age of first intercourse. And what that positive association means is that as one variable goes up, so does the other one. So the more years of mother's education means the older that the adolescent will be when they have their first sex. A non-directional hypothesis would be that mother's education level will be significantly associated with age of first intercourse. And so again, here we see how the null and the non-directional research hypothesis are phrased in pretty much identical ways, except for we have will not be significantly associated, will be significantly associated. We could also say will not be a significant predictor of. In this situation, we're conceptualizing education level, mother's education level, as an independent variable. And we've talked before about causation, and we'll talk, you guys talked last semester about causation. And so in this particular situation, we can't necessarily assume causation because we haven't experimentally controlled or manipulated this particular variable. We can't certainly control a mother's education level to be able to conclude with some certainty that that's what's causing this particular outcome. Another example is how does socioeconomic status, and in this case we're talking about this measured via household income, relate to adolescent sexual risk behavior. And in this situation we're going to say consistency of condom use. So thinking about the AdHealth data, there's a variable that asks people how consistently they've used condoms. I believe it's in the last year. Controlling for the effects of educational attainment. And so again, socioeconomic status here or income is our independent variable. Our dependent variable is consistency of condom use, which we're using as a marker for sexual risk behavior, or an operationalization of sexual risk behavior. And our null hypothesis would be that controlling for educational attainment, socioeconomic status will not be associated with consistency of condom use, so income will not be associated with consistent condom, with the outcome of consistency of condom use. A potential directional hypothesis would be that controlling for educational attainment, socioeconomic status will be positively associated with consistency of condom use, such that the higher your income, the more consistent you will report using condoms. A non-directional hypothesis could be that controlling for educational attainment, income will be significantly associated with consistency of condom use. And so we're not speculating the direction of that. It could be positive, such that as income goes up, consistency of condom use goes up, or it could be a negative association, such that as income goes up, the consistency of condom use goes down, it becomes more inconsistent. So hopefully going through some examples like that will help you think through how to phrase the questions and then how to phrase the hypotheses associated with that. One of the issues that, that some folks have in their research questions was phrasing a question as an association, but then putting in hypotheses that were about comparing groups, for example. And you can certainly often look at many of these variables in a couple of different ways. So for example, if we go back to mother's education level, as I stated when I talked about this question, we could talk about this in a continuous level, so just the number of years of education that they have. We could also look at this as, does mother's college attainment, college degree attainment influence timing of sexual initiation? So then we could say, does the age of sexual initiation differ between adolescents whose mothers have a college degree and those who do not have a college degree? And so we could answer this same overarching question about the role of mother's education level in timing of sexual initiation. We could answer that same question in a couple of different ways. So we could look at a continuous association, or we could look at a group comparison. And so as we're defining our research question and specifying that research question, we may have our sort of big picture research question about the associations that we're interested in or the relationships that we're interested in. But we have to think about how we're going to phrase that research question specifically in terms of how we're going to look at those variables. So is it a continuous variable? Is it a dichotomous or some other sort of categorical variable that we're looking at? And then how does the way in which we're going to use that variable influence the way in which we phrase the question and in which we phrase the hypotheses? And so I'll say a little bit about setting up the research question in terms of using the literature. This is a tough thing I find to teach people how to do without just giving feedback and going through various rounds of drafts and revisions. The first thing that we always want to do, and what I'm not asking you to do for the research question assignment, what I didn't ask you to do is give a basic sense of why this topic is important for some field, public health, social work, what have you. But you always want to do that in your brief report. That will be, for most of you, your first paragraph. I'm looking at pregnancy, teen pregnancy, because that's really important. Lots of teen pregnancies happen. They have all sorts of negative consequences potentially, and so we should better understand why, how, to whom, whatever these happen. And so when you're using literature to lead up to a research question, you're doing more than a literature review. You're actually trying to use the literature strategically to build to our question. And you'll still have to do a thorough literature review. You still have to know a body of literature to be able to know how to use that literature to build to your question. But you want to be able to tell your reader what we know related to this topic. And so you want to be able to do that in summary. So I know all this literature, I've read through it all, and now I can tell you in a paragraph or two what other people have found about this association, this group comparison, these relationships that I'm interested in. Or for some of you, if you're looking at a comparison for which there is not much literature out there, what's a comparison or a group difference or a relationship that might be similar to the one that I'm interested in, that might give me some sense that the association that I'm looking at might exist in the world. You also want to identify what we still need to know or know more about. And then present your question and indicate how it will fill some gap in the literature or extend our knowledge in some important way. So these are some key questions that you'll want to answer and make sure that you have given a strong rationale around as you write your introduction. Some other tips based on looking at your research questions and how you're thinking through variables. Take constructs at face values. So a few of you had the issue of looking at a particular variable and saying, well, this variable probably means this other thing, and so I'm going to use it as this marker for something else. We always have to take the constructs at face value. If something is about religiosity, we can't assume that religiosity would be associated with some other belief or attitude. We have to say that that variable is just religiosity. So we don't want to assume that a variable means something different than exactly what that variable is. And again, I mentioned this before, but we have to think about the level of measurements, whether the particular items are part of a larger scale, how they've been used by other researchers, how you might convert them or look at them or cut them up. One of the ways in which it's easy to do this for AdHealth is simply to go into Google Scholar and type in the wording of the question. And see what you come up with under Google Scholar. So most of the people who will have written about that particular question or the scale from which that question comes will report the actual wording of that item, of that question. And so you'll be able to see what other researchers have done with the AdHealth data using that question. Have they created a scale with it? Is it obviously part of some scale? That now that you've looked at other literature, you realize what that construct means or what that is. And so that will give you a better sense of how to think about how people have cut that variable up, what that scale means, how you might convert the variables, and how they've been used by other researchers. And as you're working through your literature review and your introduction, be careful to only cover literature that's relevant to your topic, to the associations or the group comparisons that you're interested in, and be really focused. I think one of the hard things for folks about quantitative research questions in particular is that they are very tiny, tiny little questions. They're often small sets of associations, particularly for what most of you are doing for this class at the levels that you're at. You're asking small, very contained questions. And so you want to make sure that you start more broad in your literature review, but that you very quickly narrow down into the specific things that you're going to be looking at. So make sure that you cover literature that is relevant to your topic and that isn't all over the place, which I think can be hard for some people to narrow that down because it all feels very important and part of a larger puzzle of how to understand specific behaviors or attitudes or thoughts in some ways. But as you're writing an intro, it's really important to be fairly narrow in your coverage of some of this literature. And the discussion is a place where you can potentially become more broad again and think about how the associations that you're looking at may be related to other factors, other kinds of associations, speculate about the reasons why those might be true in the world or not true in the world. But the intro is a place in which you're going to start more broad and then really try and narrow down fairly quickly, particularly in a brief report when you don't have a lot of space to work on an introduction. And so, as I mentioned, you'll have to do a more thorough literature review to know what literature to include in your introduction. And I think it's really helpful to write an outline first, to think about the logic in your head that brought you to the research question that you ended up with. So I'm asking this question because I want to know about this other topic, because other people have found this, and we need to know more about it because it's really important. And so thinking through sort of that level of logic and then breaking that down and working that through backwards. And for those of you who might be struggling with this a little bit, if it's helpful to you to write an introduction first and send that to me, I'm happy to look at people's introductions and give you a little bit of guidance on how to think through the logic of building to your research question a little bit better. So that is my quick and dirty take on research questions and variables and writing an introduction. For those folks who will be taking 850, in the next sequence, none of you guys obviously, but we'll spend a lot more time thinking through how to create a research question, how to use the literature to develop that research question. But hopefully this will catch you guys up to speed a little bit and help you understand some of the comments that I made on your research questions. And for many of you, I'll be meeting with you in person or over the phone and helping you think through some of these questions and helping you develop your research question. And so one of the reasons these early assignments are worth so few points and such a small percentage of your grade is that I want to be able to help you get to a good place so that once you start writing, you're not still grappling with what's your research question, how am I operationalizing this, what am I doing? So hopefully we can set you up for success early on and you'll be good to go. So as always, let me know if you have questions, if you'd like to chat more. I'm happy to talk to people one-on-one, or if multiple people have the same kind of questions and it would be useful at some point to have a Google Hangout, let me know, and I'm happy to learn how to use Google Hangout and then set that up. All right, thanks.